Or should I wait a few seconds after it hits 0? Good morning and welcome to a special BizTimes webcast series, Candid Conversations in Nonprofit Leadership. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dan Meyer, publisher of BizTimes Media. Before we begin, I'd like to thank you for your readership support and for attending this webcast today. At BizTimes Media, we're celebrating our 25th year as an independent and family business. We're proud to serve you as the only locally owned B2B media company in the region. Like many industries, the nonprofit industry has been greatly disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Fundraising, events, and regular programs have all been affected in various ways. We developed this three-part series featuring nonprofit leaders who are navigating through these challenging times. We're confident that these ideas and best practices will help you move forward in your organization. Today's program will focus on virtual fundraising and changing services amid COVID-19. On June 12th, our program title is Staying the Course During a Crisis. And June 26th, we'll discuss preparing for a new normal. You can sign up for the other two programs and access the slide deck from today at biztimes.com/NP webcast series. This program is recorded and will also be available later today. I'd like to thank our panelists for sharing their insights with us this morning. For many years, BizTimes Media has been committed to highlighting the nonprofit industry within Southeast Wisconsin and connecting it to our affluent and influential readers. You'll meet our program moderator in a moment, BizTimes Media Associate Editor, Lauren Anderson. I'd like to commend Lauren on her great job she does in covering this important industry. Our every Friday nonprofit e-newsletter features the latest nonprofit news and newsmakers. In each issue of BizTimes Milwaukee, we have 2 regular nonprofit features. Pay It Forward highlights a local business leader who gives their time, treasure, talent to the nonprofit community. The alternate issues feature nonprofit news, a nonprofit spotlight, a calendar, and a donation roundup. We're proud of our annual giving guide and thankful for the continued support of many nonprofits and sponsoring companies. Our free nonprofit directory on biztimes.com features hundreds of nonprofits. Lastly, our annual Nonprofit Excellence Awards each fall celebrates for-profit and nonprofit organizations and individuals who have demonstrated excellence in the community. We also shine the spotlight on important subjects such as homelessness and housing, which was the featured issue last year. Thanks again for attending today's webcast. So now I'd like to turn it over to BizTimes Associate Editor, Nonprofit Education and Healthcare Reporter, and our program moderator, Lauren Anderson. Lauren, take it from here.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks everybody for tuning in today. I just wanted to remind you that throughout the program, I invite you to submit your own questions using the Q&A function on Zoom. We're going to be monitoring those throughout our discussion, and we hope to get to as many of your questions as we're able to. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists today. Today joining us, we have Patty Metropulos, President and CEO of Kathy's House, Mike Gossman, President and CEO of Axe Housing, and Ginny Finn, President and CEO of YWCA Southeast Wisconsin. Thank you all for being with us. And Patty, I'd like to turn it over to you to start us off. If you could give us a quick introduction to what is Kathy's House, what is it that you do, and kind of what's the latest at your organization?
Sure, Lauren, and thank you BizTimes for hosting this webinar today, and good morning everybody, and happy Friday. For those of you who may not have heard of Kathy's House, we are a hospital guest house, which means we provide lodging and support services for families who need to come to the Milwaukee area to access medical care. If you've heard of the Ronald McDonald House, we're very much similar in mission, except that we provide lodging for patients of all ages and their family members, excuse me, and we serve all of the hospitals in the Milwaukee area. Our current facility is located in Wauwatosa, the west part of Wauwatosa, about a mile from Frater, the Medical College and Children's Hospital. We typically serve about 1,500 people a year, but as you all know, this has not been a typical year. So that the slide you see here is kind of our new normal. Throughout this, we have remained open. We faced a decision, when this all happened in March, and we turned to our hospital partners. We looked at our colleagues across the country who also run hospital guest houses to see how they were handling things. And between the staff and our board, we made the decision to remain open, quite simply because, cancer doesn't stop for COVID, trauma doesn't stop, strokes don't stop, there's still a need for organ transplants, things like that. The vast majority of families who stay with us, they are someone in their family has a cancer diagnosis. And I should clarify that we house both patients and their caregivers. So on a typical day, if we were full, we'd have about 40 people in the house, and about half of those folks would actually be patients themselves who either have been recently discharged from the hospital after surgery, or they're in the midst of receiving outpatient treatment. Typically, for cancer, and it's usually a more advanced cancer requiring a bone marrow transplant, or perhaps it's pancreatic, brain, something that requires advanced care. So Mary, if you could advance the slide, please. So here is, obviously we were impacted both operationally and financially, and I'll talk to the operational piece first. So we, as I mentioned, decided to remain open during this time. And the good news for Kathy's House is we've always been in the business of infection control. It was part of our day-to-day operations. And so this didn't really present a new challenge to us in terms of how we fundamentally go about living day to day. What it did present a challenge to us is we realized that many of the people staying at Kathy's house are cancer patients and other patients being treated for other illnesses are actually in the very highest risk category for contracting COVID-19. So what we did first and foremost was double down on our infection control efforts, working again with our hospital partners and reaching out to people such as, we currently rent our facility from St. Camillus, and I reached out to them. Obviously, they have hundreds of people in their facility that are part of a vulnerable population, and really worked with peers and allies to figure out, and CDC, looking at some of the online resources about what were the best ways to keep the house as safe and clean as possible. So we implemented a number of new protocols. This was at the end of March. And there, on the screen, you can kind of see some of the things that we've done. We do ask everyone in the house, including staff, a series of questions, screening questions about symptoms and whether anything has changed since the previous day, and we keep a log of their answers. We also take the temperatures of everyone in the house daily, with the exception of the patients, because they're already being monitored so closely by their medical care team, but their family members, my staff. We currently are not allowing any deliveries inside the house. Before we would have, like Goodwill is who we contract with for our laundry, and they would come in the house and take the old laundry out and give us the new batch, and we meet them outside now, as well, along with any other Amazon deliveries or things like that. No one really is allowed in the house unless you're medical personnel or if you're currently staying in the house. Unfortunately, that means that the families who stay with us cannot have visitors. And that has obviously, I feel very, very badly about that, but our guests understand that that's kind of how it needs to be during this time. And the same goes with, obviously, if you have a family member who's in assisted living, about that sort of protocol. We also had to discontinue all our volunteer program, and Kathy's House is a relatively small nonprofit. I have a total of 11 paid staff members. I am the only full-time person, but we have 400 volunteers. And so that has really changed our world, and we really miss our volunteers. We've tried to keep them engaged remotely as much as we can, but that was a big change for us. We are requiring everyone in the house to wear a mask. Obviously, if the guests are in their own room, they don't have to wear a mask, but anytime they're outside of their rooms, in the common areas, the kitchen, the family room, even on the back porch. And we do try to enforce social distancing within the house. So, only one family at a time in the laundry room and one family at a time in the kitchen. And actually it's gone pretty well, and the guests have been very understanding. One thing I forgot to put on here is that we've reduced the number of guests that we're allowing to stay in the house. So typically, past few years, we've been operating at full capacity. We have 18 rooms, but now we are limiting it to 50%. So 9 rooms at a maximum at any point in time. That actually dipped down pretty low in March and April. Our first response was not to allow any new reservations in the house, and frankly, we didn't have a demand for them at the time. So many cancer patients have postponed their treatments, and they're not coming to Milwaukee as they typically would for their diagnostic tests. So we have not had a waiting list, even though we're at reduced capacity. So it'll be very interesting to see what will happen in, June, July, August. We know that there's a tremendous backlog of treatments for cancer patients that has taken place, and we're kind of positioning ourselves to respond to that when the time comes. So I do hope that we'll have another, safe month. We've gotten through this without anyone testing positive, without anyone, if someone does present with symptoms, our staff members, of course, are encouraged not to come to work. And if we can get, another month of safe operations behind us, we would probably look at incrementally getting back up to our normal capacity, because I really think that the need is going to be there. So if you could, Mary, please advance the slide. So that's kind of what we did on the operational side of the house. On the financial side of the house, like everyone else, that COVID has had a tremendous impact on our revenues. So we are dependent on guest revenues, as well as revenues from our events, and then as well as revenues from foundations and corporate support, and then obviously revenues from individuals. So we're not overly dependent on any one source of revenue, which is good, but all of our primary revenue sources have been affected. So since we've had to reduce the number of guests in the house, and our guest donations have gone down, by over 50%. We had our annual gala that was scheduled for May 16th. It's our largest fundraiser of the year, raises almost a quarter of our total annual operating revenue. And so we switched that to a critical operations campaign. And that was launched in April. And it culminated on May 16th with a small online auction event. And I'm happy to report that we had a very, very positive response to it. And we actually raised more through the critical operations campaign than we did last year at our gala. So last year at our gala, we raised about $130,000. And this year, with the critical operations campaign and a virtual auction, we exceeded that by quite a bit. So I'm very, very thankful to our supporters. And we really used our e-blast capabilities, social media, as well as individual donor outreach in order to really get the word out. So I engage volunteers, to call donors, because we have several thousand on our list. And so we tried to reach every person we could. I actually, my marketing team recommended I do a video of myself, at home. That was kind of a first for me. That's not something I'm necessarily comfortable doing or want to do, but then we put that video online, and really my goal was to be very transparent and say, this is how we're impacted. I need your help so we can continue to remain open and keep on track, because we will be moving into a new house in about a year that will be double the size. So this final slide here just talks about, in addition to the critical operations campaign, we are still planning to move into our new facility in about a year. We actually are breaking ground July 1st, and we will be located right on the Milwaukee Regional Medical Center campus. We're designing it to be the national model in hospital guest housing. We have about almost $2 million to go to reach our goal. So we've tried to keep that capital campaign on track as well, but we did have to put it on pause and shift to our critical operations campaign. So hopefully, if we can kind of stabilize funding, we can then shift back to the emphasis being the capital campaign this summer. So that's it in a nutshell. So
great. Thank you, Patty, for sharing that. Mike, I'd like to pass it over to you. If you could introduce us to Axe Housing and give us an update on what's going on with your organization.
Absolutely. Well, first to Dan and Lauren and the BizTimes, thanks so much for hosting this. You really keep a spotlight on all the tremendous work that's happening in the nonprofit community. I know we've got a huge group of attendees listening in, viewing this session, and I guess kudos to realizing the critical role that all of those organizations that are present on the phone are playing in improving our community, both before the pandemic and during the pandemic. I'll keep my opening brief. Axe Housing, we provide all the services a family needs to transition from a renter to a homeowner. So we tend to work with low income families, moderate income families, and we provide them with 4 key services. We counsel them to help get them ready for home ownership. We're a real estate brokerage, so once we're able to connect them to financing and they're ready to look for a home, we have realtors that can represent them and find them a house they can really afford and that's right for them. And many of our families actually choose to purchase a distressed home and fix it up because that's the most affordable path to home ownership. And for those families, we actually have rehab counselors or coaches on our staff that help the families with the rehabs, help make sure the families do the right things, follow the right process, engage the right contractors, do sweat work the right way to keep the rehab affordable. And many of those families actually receive financing directly from an affiliate of ours, Axe Lending, that will lend money to families for the rehab of distressed homes. We can move to the next slide. So we've been around for 25 years, operating throughout that time in Milwaukee. Last year, we opened up our first office outside of Milwaukee in Beloit, Wisconsin, with the firm belief that the model that we've honed in Milwaukee can be of benefit to other communities in the state of Wisconsin and beyond. And so this is just a snapshot of what we've been able to accomplish during our time doing this work. In Milwaukee, supported more than 2,700 families in transitioning from renters to homeowners. Approximately a third of those transactions actually were families that were purchasing distressed homes and fixing them up. And you look at the total investment in the city of Milwaukee over that time, more than $150 million in the purchase and the rehab of these homes. And again, we work with a diverse population, that represents the city. Tend to work with larger families. Average family size we work with is 4, and typically households earn $41,000 a year, but some earn less, some earn more. Finally, the last slide. We're really focused not just on helping families get into homes, but to make sure they're sustainable. And so I'm really proud with the long-term ability our families have shown to be able to maintain their homes. We have a 94% success rate in our history of families being successful with their home ownership, maintaining their homes, and a foreclosure rate that's a half to a third of what has been experienced in our broader communities that we work in. And so COVID's posed lots of challenges to our model. I will say we have some advantages that, are just inherent in our model, and not because we were smart, but because it's just the way we've always done things. We're not an organization that brings people together in large groups. So there's been fewer challenges, I guess, to our day-to-day business, but we've needed to, in a whole host of ways that I'm excited to talk about, tweak the way we provide services in order to keep our staff and our families safe, both of which tend to come from the areas of our city that have the highest concentration of COVID-19 patients. So we've worked hard to provide a high level of service and do so while keeping people as safe as we can. So excited to chat more about it.
Great. And Jenny, can you introduce us to YWCA Southeast Wisconsin? Oh, Jenny, you're on mute.
Okay, there we go. So I would like to echo Mike and Patty's thanks to the BizTimes and to you and to Dan for the opportunity to share this information. I look forward to learning from my fellow panelists and also from the audience and to attending the other 2 sessions. So YWCA, if you could advance the slide, please. YWCA is actually in its 127th year in this community. We're part of a national affiliate organization, and we all have the same mission to eliminate racism and empower women. However, how we approach that is supposed to be specific to what our vision is for our particular communities. And we serve all of Southeast Wisconsin. Primarily that activity is in Milwaukee and Racine County, but it does include some activity in Waukesha, Ozaki, and often Kenosha's knocking on the door, but capacity is the issue. So really what we try to see in the long term is we really want a flourishing community, as is mentioned there in the vision statement. And so what that means as a practical matter is that by design, we are providing essential services. And if we ever didn't understand this, we've learned it through COVID, that we are actually a linchpin in a network of essential services. And that linchpin concept has really been, I think, crucial within not just the nonprofit community, but I think the business community, the for-profit business community, the social sector, and government entities, I think have really started to be more candid, perhaps, that we are more an integrated system than we are necessarily aware. And I think that might be part of an interesting discussion as we go forward. But it has meant that there have been adventures. We did, to use the popular word, pivot quite quickly. We had actually been talking about remote delivery of services for a hybrid business model for some time. Not that we'd actually done anything other than sketch things out and talk through it. I must say that our chief technology officer is delighted that after more than a year of having teams on our software package, that we finally learned to use it and enjoy it. So that's kind of an upside of being forced into this situation. But we were remotely delivering services within 3 days of the governor's stay safe order. And in fact, we actually began work on that the week prior, before it was official. Partially, I think we all in the entire community started to see that this was coming faster than we expected. But because of that, all of our services, with the exception of one subset, we were able to begin delivery remotely right away. We also had to deal with the fact that we are a landlord. So we have a number of other social service agencies in our building. A number of them, we provide their IT services. And for a number of them, they have government contracts, and they were not free under the terms of those contracts to stop providing in-person services despite the stay safe at home order. So although our staff was remote quite quickly, we still had to stay here and provide services until those other issues got worked out. And that took about a week to 10 days. And then pretty much, other than 3 administrative people, including myself, everybody's remote. I could work at home, but quite frankly, I don't have to share bandwidth if I'm at the office with my husband who's working from home. It also, as an overall vision thing, we were in the midst of strategic planning. We had already announced last December a change in our business model was forthcoming. And now that's obviously accelerating. Can you guys hear vacuuming? I'm just asking, yeah. I can't believe it. The only other person in the building is I'm just gonna have, if it's not disturbing, I won't go tell him to stop. Okay. Next slide, please. So really our philosophy of how we do business has turned out to be very useful. We actually believe that our work is about sustainable impact. And we believe that happens through a combination of direct service and culture change. We kind of talk about it as micro impact that would affect an individual and that which affects a broader culture. And actually, Mike is one of my favorite people who gives a great example of this. Individual homeowners' lives change, but they're rebuilding entire neighborhoods. And that's what we talk about when we talk about culture and genuine broad impact. So as I mentioned, our services were uninterrupted, but they were also expanded. We established a new support line using skills that we already had. And because most of the folks who use our economic empowerment services, I'm sorry, I've got to stop them.
That is
Cats cats and children interrupting things. That was the vacuum cleaner. Sorry. So our support line took advantage of the fact that we were checking in for a number of existing program reasons with all our program participants. So we used that process to establish whether or not the family was getting their other needs. And we were able to then collaborate with other organizations that provided food and shelter and other emergency needs in a very systemic way. The other thing we were able to do is that part of one of our services is a community-based adult ed program. This primarily would be thought of through HSED and GED. And that includes We Solve the Digital Divide in collaboration with another nonprofit for our students. And so we took that skill set and are doing a smaller project that is focused on students in foster care who are at risk of not graduating from high school. And if they do not successfully graduate, despite the fact that we've helped solve that digital divide for them, they have been pre-assessed in order to move very smoothly into our programs. Because of course, the interruption of education is going to affect our overall business economy and will have many layers. So the screen just shows you the type of services that we have. We did do a virtual event, and I'm sure when we get to the Q&A, we can talk about that in a little more detail. But we made that decision at the same time that we changed all our operating services, simply because we had an anniversary to celebrate. I'm delighted to tell you that financially it was very close to the original goal anyway. And we will have a companion in-person event later in the fall when it's appropriate and safe to do so. Next slide. So some of our reflections is that we do our work in 3 buckets: racial justice, health and safety, and economic empowerment. And we really see that racial justice and economic empowerment are underpinnings of health and safety, and I think COVID has really demonstrated that. Certainly the economic empowerment that is impossible because of a digital divide has been a huge topic of conversation, and certainly the underlying social determinants of health have clearly burdened in metropolitan Milwaukee our communities of color more so than others. So as you can see, one of the things we've been talking about in our strategic planning internally as well as with partner organizations are how we might share our assets and collaborate more effectively with others. We're also looking at beyond the latter part of 2020 because we think there's opportunity to work more effectively together, both within nonprofits in the social sector, but also with public and private collaboration than we might have ever imagined. It is amazing how creative we've all become. And we also think that our work in racial justice, especially how it impacts women of color, is probably going to get even more attention, not just from us, but others as we move forward. And we're looking forward to being part of that.
Great.
And that's it, other than our website. I think that's the only other slide.
Right. Thank you, Ginny. Well, I'd like to dive right into the questions. We're getting some from the audience, and it seems like top of mind for several of our attendees is virtual fundraising. There's just several questions here about how did you do it? What have you seen that's been successful? And have there been lessons that you've learned of things that just haven't worked?
I guess I'll dive in there. So we decided March 13th that we could not hold our in-person event, Circle of Women, on April 23rd as planned. We decided, even though we had no expertise and knowledge, that we would still have some type of virtual experience that night, because if for no other reason, we thought we need to stay connected with people. And it was a very important anniversary. It was the 25th anniversary of that event. And that date was actually the date of the first time it had ever been held. But we had no clue what we were doing. And I think maybe the lucky part about that is since our event was so early in this experience, one is forgiven for not being perfect at something early on. I'm thinking by August, events are probably supposed to be a little more polished. But I'm also very pleased with how it worked out. So a couple of things. The first thing we did was we prioritized communications. And in fact, everything I'm going to tell you probably won't surprise you because nothing's different because it's virtual. It's just a new tool. It's just a new channel. We immediately spoke with our leadership committee, who were the volunteers framing that event. We immediately had direct conversations with each and every sponsor. And we also reached out to key stakeholders who had been traditionally attending this event. And although some were hesitant that we would have a fundraising event, most of them said, as long as you shape your ask and your message in a way that's sensitive to what's going on, absolutely. We also saw that it was as important an event so people knew what we were doing in the time of COVID and how our services were or were not proceeding. But we also then decided to sign up for every virtual event we noticed that was happening before then, so we could learn from others, quite frankly. So one of the first lessons we learned is, do not try and recreate your actual in-person event. It just doesn't work. So just accept the fact that you may want a feeling or a theme that's the same, but how you approach it will probably have to be different. And people's attention span pretty much after an hour, forget it. I mean, it just is, it's tough. On the other hand, we also wanted to make sure we had something that was interactive. And so that drove our platform selection. We ended up choosing Global Meet, and we chose it specifically because it had the ability to provide live feed, pre-recorded feed, interactive chat, drop-down packages. I mean, there was nothing it really couldn't do, although we ended up not using as many features as it technically can, just because that becomes a lot of unnecessary busyness. One of the lessons we learned after the fact is we weren't aware that some of the services they provided were available with local businesses. And so now that I know that, as we go forward with our virtual plans for everything, we're going to be talking to local businesses first. The real challenge, of course, for them is the cost, because these larger businesses can provide things much more cheaply. The other thing we decided with respect to that event was, because we didn't have a lot of technology skill in-house, we were going to pay to have it. So, I mean, this cost us not even $3,000, it was a little bit of money. And we paid some extra to have some security features that weren't otherwise available. But the main issue there for us was we wanted real-time technology support. So many of the services we looked into, you could call an 800 number or text somebody if something went wrong during your event, but you were really technically supposed to be running it yourself, and we didn't want to have to become experts in 3.5 weeks, as well as be worried about the content of the event. Other than that, we were just lucky. Some pre-recorded stories had existed because we were so close to the actual date. And a lot of the video that we recorded was done on everybody's phone. And we did have a small piece that was live. And we also committed to being interactive and had an entire social media strategy that actually turned out to be quite festive. People posting online during the event and providing opportunities to post things after the event. And having that link live the entire time so people could make a donation proved to be quite effective.
Patty, it sounds like your campaign was successful. Can you talk a little bit about what you attribute that to?
Sure. So I think one thing that made it compelling is that I went to the sponsors who sponsored our gala for last year and asked them to again sponsor the event this year, even though we weren't, having an in-person gala. And they all agreed, which was wonderful. So I then came up with a $50,000 in sponsorship, which was then used as a matching challenge, to the rest of our supporters. So we used that as kind of something to jumpstart people, to say, that this match will be in effect until, I forget, it was like early April till May 16th. And then weekly, we would include either through our email blast to everyone in our email database, we would include a story about a guest currently in the house. We did a news release, a media release about the fact that we had to cancel our gala and we're transitioning to a critical operations campaign. And we were kind of surprised it was picked up, you know, by a number of media outlets, not just locally, but across the state. And we found that they were kind of hungry, you know, for this sort of story. So really anything we could to get our message out there. We did pay, you know, to boost our Facebook posts, which if you're not doing it, I would highly recommend it. We found it to be a great return on investment. We traditionally have used a platform called GiveSmart to do our mobile bidding at our gala. And so when we did our auction on May 16th, that was, you know, only on that day. We again used that software system, which was great. You know, we didn't have any Facebook Live feeds or anything like that. We really decided to put our energy into just the email communication and calling some donors prior to the event. But I will say we were, you know, had scheduled our groundbreaking ceremony on July 1st for the new house. We are going to have to do that as a virtual event. And we really learned some things, you know, like Ginny, we had never done the whole thing virtually. This was our first time. And so we learned some things, you know, using GiveSmart that we will employ for the groundbreaking event on July 1st. And we will also include a FaceTime Live event, a pre-recorded video. You know, it's still taking shape, and I'm really pulling in my whole marketing committee and expertise. And luckily, we have some people that are very knowledgeable, you know, from Freighter and that work for much larger organizations that are donating their time and expertise. And we will have a little bit of costs in terms of, you know, putting the video together, things like that. But you know, just to echo what Ginny said, this is a first for us. You know, we just plowed ahead and did the best we could. And so we just found that being transparent with our donors was probably the most important thing to do. And just stay engaged with them and try to stay in front with them and ask them how they're doing. This has upended everyone's life. So
I do want to add real quickly, and Dan and Lauren, I don't know if this is possible. We did I shouldn't say we, my amazing colleagues, because one of the advantages here is some of our younger colleagues were simply thrown in and did the work. Really impressed with them. This has been a professional development experience like none other. But they did a Zoominar about a week and a half ago that explained our thought process and our planning and what we think worked out and what we thought didn't work out. But also at the end of that Zoominar is an actual link to our event. And I'm happy to send that to you, Lauren or Dan, so that we shared with everyone that's on this later in the day, so that they could all see what happened and they could decide what was useful and what they would never want to do the way we did it.
That's great. That's a good suggestion there. Mike, I know that interestingly, I understand ACTS saw sort of an increase in interest in home ownership during this over the past few months here. You talked a little bit about pivoting your services virtually. Could you talk about how ACTS has responded and continued to meet that demand that you've been seeing?
Absolutely. So it's been surprising to us, you know, when initially the pandemic started to hit, we thought, okay, well, people aren't going to be able to focus on home ownership now. They're going to be focused on, you know, food, shelter, you know, job. And actually what we've seen, I think, is people are cooped up in their apartments, maybe with numerous kids, maybe with a spouse, that owning their own home eventually and having a space they control has moved way to the top of their priority list. And so the biggest thing we did, which is something that admittedly we should have done a long time ago, is that we moved what was an in-person orientation that needed to happen, we thought, in our offices to be effective. And we moved that on demand online. And we did so with trepidation because we weren't, what we thought might happen is lots of people would listen, but then they wouldn't show up for their subsequent appointments. And that had been our fear, that if we made it too easy to access this information, we would just have schedules filled with no-shows because people weren't really that committed to the process. And instead, what we saw is that some combination of the pandemic and the ease of accessing this information, we've seen a 300+% increase in attendees in our orientation as we were seeing pre-pandemic. And that although their conversion to in-person appointments is at a lower rate than we experienced for the in-person orientations, it's more than made up for in volume. So, we have greater demand for our services right now than we've ever had. And that's at a time when we're only providing services over the phone, via Zoom, or Facebook, and also providing services online. So it's been, I guess, a leadership lesson for me and our team. We had some of these preconceived notions, some things we weren't really willing to try. This has forced us to try some of them. Mm-hmm. And it's proven to us that some of our assumptions just weren't right.
Jenny,
I would echo the same thing, in particular with our adult ed program, which we presumed it is true that the cohort learning is essential, but the fact that it has to be cohort learning in person has proved not to be necessarily exactly what we thought it was. And because of the physical size of the classrooms, a cohort might be no more than 25 or 30 people. And then we were worried about our first new cohort after this all started, which started May 11th. And once we got rid of duplications, we had over 800 applications for that cohort. So we are going to be dramatically expanding that programming as our resources allow, but we made the wrong assumption. And it's a great lesson to learn because now we can be more effective.
I'd like to touch on, each of you spoke a little bit about to keeping staff and your clients safe during this time. As the state's reopening, as we're returning to a new normal, what are some of the strategies that you're implementing to ensure that your staff members are safe, that the people that you serve are safe? How are you turning the dial on your services as we reopen?
I can jump in, Lauren. I think that our what we've discovered is that we can provide our services very effectively without having our office open. And because of that, we're going to be very slow to reopen our offices, even for our own staff. In part because our staff comes from some of the sort of, hardest hit areas of the city, but also because we're somewhat wary that if we moved everyone back, in addition to potentially having some health risks in our building that's not really set up for it, we might actually lose some of the traction we've had in improving our operations through the use of technology. We've been able over the last couple of months to just make some massive strides in terms of our use of technology and ability to do work more efficiently, even though we're not all in the same place. And so both from a community health perspective and also from a business perspective, we're going to be on the back end of folks transitioning back to the office. And we haven't, because of that, we haven't needed to decide exactly what that's going to look like at X.
We're similar in that regard. So we actually, our two locations, Milwaukee and Racine, closed as of March 16th. The Racine location remains closed to the public, although the Milwaukee location, as of this past Tuesday, has begun its phased-in opening. However, our first question was safety, and our next question was, what's the business need? And because of the technology pivots that have been mentioned, and because of the fact that we've been able to deliver everything we normally do and more, we have no business need to actually change this right now. And we also, when we do it, want to make sure we do it safely. Now, that's not true of all of the tenants in our building. And so as of Tuesday, some of them are seeing people on site on a limited basis. We coordinated all that with them in advance. And we have done all the recommended safety precautions. one point of entry into our building, and you don't go any further until after your hands are washed. If you don't have a mask, we provide them to you. Thank you, United Way. And then they check in and have a health questionnaire that we're probably familiar with at many of the places we now go. And then they are escorted and met by the personnel from client tenant that having them come in. And based on 4 days, it's working out okay. But it hasn't been a flurry of people. And we've actually been really appreciative of the MMAC, MCW daily updates that are provided, watching the health data. And certainly if large sophisticated businesses already decided that unless they have an absolute business necessity, they're not asking their employees to come back until after Labor Day, I think we can rely on some of their analysis for our decision making. That being said, we will, depending on the health statistics, revisit this on a regular basis because being part of an essential network of support, there are just some things that are more effective in person, but it's going to be a decision-making process that we visit on a weekly basis.
Yeah, and I'll just say that, you know, immediately kind of when this happened, we went down to just those staff working in guest services being at the house. And we started out with just having one guest services staff on site as well as our housekeeping staff. And then we moved, as more guests started to come into the house as of May 1st, we now have 2 people in guest services working at one point in time, along with housekeeping, but everyone else is working remotely. And luckily, I've learned many lessons through this process, but one very valuable lesson was we have invested, the board and the organization has invested in our infrastructure in the past 5 years. So we've implemented a new donation system, a new reservation system, went to a cloud-based server, and all of our software platforms are now cloud-based. And before this, my philanthropy staff, marketing staff had been working remotely for the most part anyway. So it really, the biggest change was for me. You know, I had worked remotely quite a bit, but typically I was in the office almost every day, and that has been a big change for me. But, you know, luckily people are pretty willing to jump on Zoom calls, and we're using a platform called Slack for real-time communication that we were using before this, but that has proved to be invaluable. So, you know, I would just say those infrastructure things that, you know, maybe you haven't gotten around to, well, yeah, I think you've either had to hurry up and implement them, or you've maybe taken more advantage of their capability than you had before.
I know that it's clear that the pandemic has highlighted some already existing disparities, longstanding disparities in the community. Not least among them is a difference in access to technology. Have you found that any of your clients don't have access to technology to engage with the services you're providing? And how do you address that?
Yes. So yes, it's a huge problem. Part of addressing it, we already had processes through some of our other programs. So we've just taken that knowledge and moved it to a broader platform. But it's both access to equipment as well as access to some type of internet provider, which is not necessarily, despite some of the good things that have been done by Time Warner and Spectrum, et cetera, it's still an AT&T, et cetera. It's not solving the problem. And the other piece of it is there's a presumption of knowledge about how to use technology. Although even a smartphone with a limited contract is not an unusual thing to find even in a low-income home. It doesn't mean that we have a population that has expertise in the way that people who use technology every day for work would. And this isn't just about the services that YWCA might provide, but I'll give one of the reasons we decided to work with the foster care population is that many of these young people, without the technology connection, it's not just about school. They can't get their counseling services, which are now being offered remotely. They are often at an age where they may be aging out of the foster care system, so they need to be looking for work. You can't do any of those things on a Chromebook. And so it has been, we're actually part of a working group right now that is examining this question and not only testing certain things, but probably making recommendations for going forward. But we look at it as if you don't have access to a digital world right now, that's the same thing as not having running water or electricity. It is that. And I think we all knew this intellectually, but now to see the consequences, I'm really actually moved by the fact that people don't see it necessarily as a problem, but as something that if we put our heads together, we can resolve.
We got a question from the audience about, again, about fundraising. Do you find that you are more selective now about who you're approaching for donations, given the economic circumstances that a lot of people find themselves in right now?
I would say the approach we're taking is we're using this period where many people who have the capability to help, I think, are grappling with their own challenges in their own life. So even if financially they're in a position to help, there's uncertainty, there's a change in their routines. So we're really using this opportunity to stay connected through Zoom calls, through phone calls, through personal relationships with so many of our supporters, focused on how they're doing and just developing our relationships with them as people. And what we've seen from that outreach is that most people really seem to want to help. And so they're excited to hear how our organization or others that they support are finding their way through this difficult time. And when they learn of needs that need to be addressed, oftentimes they're stepping forward. So we're not being presumptuous and assuming that every single person who used to support us at a certain level would be able to continue at that level. But we're also not assuming that they don't want to help and aren't able to help. So I'd say we're casting as wide a net as we historically have. The real challenge in this period, and it's something that we don't have a good answer for, is how do you attract the new supporters? As a relatively small organization that people have not generally heard of, it's really tough to develop a meaningful relationship between a donor and your organization through a conference call or a Zoom. And so we're really doubling down on existing relationships and focusing on them because we're just not sure that we're going to be able to develop those new relationships that we ordinarily would in this time period.
I think I'll just jump in there. When this whole thing started, I thought that, okay, now the plan is we really need to just concentrate on a select group of our donors, and really kind of target them. But when we launched our critical operations campaign, like Michael was saying, we did cast our net wide with a news release and e-blasts and Facebook. And as it turned out, 40% of the people who donated to our critical operations campaign were first-time donors. We did not expect that. We were extremely pleased and just grateful that people stepped up to, and we're a relatively unknown nonprofit. So to me, it really speaks to our marketing efforts over the past few years. And so now the challenge is to steward these new donors and really, start to get to know them. And so we've engaged our board of directors in writing thank you notes. And volunteers that can no longer come to the house, we've said, hey, here's the list of hundreds of how many donors, and could you start on this group, and writing them notes or calling them. We just don't have the bandwidth for paid staff to call all these people. So I'm really trying to deploy and leverage our volunteers and our board as much as we can.
Looks like we have time for about one more question. I'd love it if we could just go down the line. The biggest leadership lesson that you in the past few months here. Jenny, you want to start us off?
Anything different than we already knew. Pay attention to people. The thing that has been the single most important thing that has happened here at YWCA is that we became more and more communicative. So everybody knew here internally what was going to happen externally before we announced it. We have had really incredible Zoom meetings. We have a little over 30 on our staff. And those are regular, those are frequent, and quite frankly, they're candid. And the first one, when we were all probably in a very anxious state, the first one was the 19th of March. So it was that first week. I think that first week, whatever, yeah, it was that first week. And I said, I'm going to talk a lot for the first 15 minutes because I want you to have the same information that I have. And it may be stuff that's actually going to make you anxious. So I acknowledged up front that there were going to be financial problems unless certain things happened. And I identified what those were. I also identified that we had already met with the board. I mean, our board has been they have kicked it out of the park. It has been a board staff partnership all along. I can't say enough about our board. But I made very clear to the full staff that if we had to make financial decisions that affected employment or compensation, that our number one priority was to make sure that we took care of our staffs and didn't provide any surprises to the extent that we might have to. And that our number one thing was their health and safety as well. So that included that if we had to approach reductions in staffing or compensation, it would be done in a way that would preserve everybody's access to healthcare. That was a huge concern, especially when we knew so little about what was going to come. And I think the ongoing candor and back and forth conversation has created a level of trust that has also made staff willing to try new things. And I'm just incredibly grateful for the caliber of people that I get to work with.
Great. Mike, you, biggest leadership lesson?
I think we're failing a lot more right now in such a positive way. We've just, this pandemic has forced us to try so many new things so quickly, and it's gotten all of us more comfortable trying things as a team, as a leadership group, and then doubling down on what's working and jettisoning the things that just aren't. And so I'm really hopeful that remains a part of our culture, even once we return to the office, because we're learning much faster right now than we have at any other point, in the 8 years I've been with the organization. And I know that's going to benefit the families and the neighborhoods that we serve if we can continue with that, even once things, quote unquote, return to normal.
And I would just kind of echo what Michael and Jenny have said. And just to me, it's the value of shared leadership. And, when this whole thing started, we started our Zoom meetings, I thought about, well, maybe I should just meet with my marketing people and then just meet with my philanthropy people and then my guest services people. But we all kind of did it all at once. And it really, there's been some very emotional Zoom meetings, especially for the folks that are working on the front line. I mean, they are our nurses and our doctors, and I want to give them the space to just, say, I am scared to come to work. And when this whole thing started, I did, talk to, communicate with all of my frontline staff individually and said, I need you to tell me your comfort level in coming to work. every day, because you are the people that are working with our guests, and you are at the greatest risk. And there is no wrong answer. You know, that really helped inform my decision whether to remain open or not, quite frankly. And had I not had their support and their dedication, I don't think we would have remained open. So I really let that be their call. And I just think that that level of transparency and candor, you know, helped us through all this. And, you know, they helped me put together our 3-phase plan for if someone in the house were to test positive, here are the phases we go through to shut down and then reopen again. So, and I just think, you know, transparency with donors, with the board, you know, all of our hospital partners, all of our, you know, like when this whole thing started, I, you know, talked to Ann at Ronald McDonald House and reached out to colleagues in Chicago and across the country. And they were a huge source of support for us. And really just, if anything, let me know that everyone was kind of flailing and doing it as graciously and as formed as possible. But yeah, so.
Great. Well, thank you, each of you, for sharing your insights with us today. We really appreciate it. This concludes the first in our Candid Conversations with in Nonprofit Leadership series. A reminder that today's slide deck will be available on the registration site, so you can access it there. As Dan mentioned earlier, we will have 2 other webcasts in this series. The next one will be on June 12th. Which will focus on staying the course during a crisis. There will be an additional one on June 26th, which is going to focus on preparing for the new normal. You can sign up for those webcasts at biztimes.com/NP webcast series. We look forward to seeing you all then, and thank you again for joining us today. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.